It's a particular pleasure to be able to inaugurate this inaugural event of the Gulf International Forum, which has already made a name for itself in Washington by hosting very reasoned and reasonable discussions and by publishing careful analysis. I'm the proud recipient of their book on the Gulf crisis, which will be available to everybody during the day, newly published, hot off the presses. I trust that this conference will lead on to even bigger and better things. Let me introduce, I think I'll do everybody at once in the interest of time. Ambassador Martin Indyk, known to almost everybody in the room, I think, twice ambassador to Israel, served as President Obama's Middle East envoy, and he'll focus on the winners and losers in the regional confrontations with Iran. Dr. Mohammed Al-Rumaihi, has a distinguished military and diplomatic career, most notably as ambassador to Washington. And he'll talk about the GCC and whether it's clinically dead. Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen comes to us from the Baker Institute, and he's written extensively on Gulf politics and economics, including especially Qatar and the UAE. He'll talk about the future of the GCC economies that Danya has already referred to in the context of their historical relationship with the US, which is changing rather dramatically, I think. Ambassador Gerald Feierstein is a Korea Foreign Service officer. I don't usually recite a Foreign Service officer's postings, but in this case, I think they're very instructive. He's served in Islamabad, Tunis, Riyadh, Peshawar, Muscat, Jerusalem, Beirut, and Sana'a. And I don't think there are too many people who can boast a better set of capitals. He was ambassador in Sana'a in 2010 to 2013. He'll guide us in thinking about the international community role in bringing the warring parties in Yemen to some sort of political agreement. And former Congressman James Moran, whom I've known by reputation for all the decades I've lived in Washington, D.C., represented Virginia 8 from 1991 to 2015, and he's going to talk about how domestic politics affect U.S. policy toward the Gulf, including on the Iran nuclear deal, on Yemen, on arms sales, and Iraq. Martin, will you lead us off? You can stay there or come up here as you prefer.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a little hard to see you with these lights shining into my eyes, but I can see Pat Thuros, and I want to congratulate him on this first conference of the Gulf International Institute. Pat and I go back a long way to the beginning of my time in government service in the White House of President Clinton in my first year, when I could barely find Qatar on the map, and suddenly Ambassador Thuros is telling us we've got a regime change process underway, and we depended on his wise counsel in those days, and it all worked out very well. So delighted to have the opportunity to work with you again in this endeavor of yours to promote the understanding of Gulf affairs here in Washington. I was asked to do a kind of balance sheet of winners and losers in the confrontation with Iran, and the obvious point is that this can only be a snapshot in a conflict and rivalry that has been waged over decades now, and we can expect it, I think, to be waged for many more decades. Second problem with doing a balance sheet is that if you try to predict trend lines in the Middle East, that is always hostage to unexpected and unpredictable events. And so we have today the horrendous Khashoggi murder, which has the potential to upset all the other calculations because it creates a uncertainty, instability in one of the pillars of the anti-Iran coalition, which of course is Saudi Arabia, which leads the anti-Iran coalition in the Arab world, along with Israel and the United States. And this is obviously putting a good deal of strain on the US-Saudi relationship with unpredictable directions once the Senate and Congress get involved. There's very little support for Saudi Arabia on the Hill, as demonstrated by the Justice legislation vote. But I think it's fair to say that there's even less support now. And Congress can act in a way that the President may not be able to control in this situation. In addition, we should recall that the maximum pressure campaign that the Trump administration is leading against Iran depends in main on the effectiveness of the oil sanctions which are about to come into effect at the beginning of November. And the ability to sustain that maximum pressure depends in good measure on Saudi Arabia's willingness to expand its oil production to make up for the Iranian oil production that's going to be taken off the market. To the extent that that doesn't happen, and we're talking about a very short period of time now, while we're dealing with this crisis over the Khashoggi murder, can have a profound impact on the price of oil, which can undermine the overall purpose of the sanctions. Since Iran's budget breaks even at $55 a barrel, and since the price of oil is already now at $80 a barrel, Iran could engage in significant price discounts in order to try to avoid the effects of the oil sanctions. So overall, this crisis that is now upon us in relations with Saudi Arabia is a windfall for Iran in terms of any kind of balance sheet. On the other side, of course, Iran is a big loser from the United States' withdrawal from the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and the reimposition of sanctions. Its economy was already in trouble before this. It will inevitably cause further damage. And it could exacerbate the internal tensions which have been on the rise over the last year. Then there's Yemen. That's low-cost, high-gain for Iran. It is converting what was a toehold with the Houthis to a real foothold in Yemen on Saudi Arabia's southern border that's creating real problems for Saudi Arabia. The whole rash, headstrong engagement in Yemen, ignoring decades of experience with what a quagmire Yemen is, has resulted in high cost for Saudi Arabia, not only in material and financial terms, but in particular terms of the humanitarian cost to the Yemeni people, which is all being laid at the foot of the Saudis. And because of the humanitarian issue of Khashoggi's murder now, on top, it's going to highlight even more the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is stuck there and would be wise to get out as quickly as possible. But I don't envisage that happening anytime soon, and that's a big plus for Iran. Qatar, the siege of Qatar, led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, is only driving Qatar into Iran's arms, since it has no other outlet but using the air channels over Iran and importing food from Iran. Iraq is somewhat of a draw. We can get into that in the discussion, but I think that in terms of the way that the technocratic leadership has now been established in Iraq, it's a kind of balance between the United States and Iran for influence there, in which I don't see that either side is really winning the game at this point, and it will probably continue like that. Syria is a place where Iran is under increased pressure from the Israeli and US combined effort to get the Russians in particular and the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad out, to get them to push the Iranian forces out. But it's far from clear that is ever going to happen. I think the Iranians are hunkering down for long term there, and Israel is now more constrained as a result of the latest incident with the shooting down of a Russian aircraft, killing of 15 Russian military personnel, which has led the Russians to announce that they're going to provide S-300s to the Syrian regime, and that complicates Israel's ability to counter Iran's efforts to establish its bases in Syria by using kinetic force. Plus, there is a big question mark whether President Trump is really committed to staying the distance in Syria in the way that Iran is. And he's kind of made it clear that he really wants to get out of there. And as the ISIS operations are being mopped up now, I think that his desire to get out is going to increase. So the Iranians have a bigger stake there than the United States, and I think that that is going to trend in their favour. Finally, Lebanon, where Hezbollah continues to have the upper hand, and I don't see any real threat to its position there. So, just to summarise, the game is far from over. The sanctions that the United States is about to impose on Iran's oil exports could have a fairly important impact on Iran, but its ability to hunker down, exploit the mistakes that Saudi Arabia in particular is making, in particular in Yemen, but also with the Khashoggi murder, leads to a situation in which I think one would have to say that at the moment Iran has the slight advantage in a very fluid picture. Thank you.
Dr. Rumaihi?
Yes, sir.
Martin has outlined a very difficult situation from the GCC point of view.
Thank you very much,
Is
sir.
the GCC dead or not? Can it respond to this challenge?
Sir, it's a very good morning to everybody here, and it is customary that one start by thanking the organizer for this very important meeting. And it is customary as well that any organizer will ask you to speak on subject, and then you find that the title put to you at the last minute have got a little bit flavor. So that's why, if it is dead or not. I have put some notes I would like to share with the audience some of the general ideas which I would like them to share with me. First of all, it's almost for 1.5 centuries, security in the Gulf was under the hegemony of the British Raj since the mid of the 18th century until the second half of the 20th century. At the time, the challenge facing the British power is very limited, keeping the peace between rival tribes factions, especially in the sea, later in land if the necessary arises. The brief time starting from the late quarter of the 20th century, the security of the Gulf was under the American Raj. American Raj was almost in confusion state so far. First, it was over the horizon, and later, especially after 9/11, the interest grew, but an uncalculated risk to my mind. It's come to Iraq with almost no exit strategy. What resulted after that was a chaos as it's prevailing today in Mesopotamia. The outcome of the American policy in Iraq opened the door for the Iranian to advance their interests into Iraq and beyond. The only one strategic successful for the American Raj in the Gulf was the freeing of Kuwait. It was sharp, calculated, but unfortunately, it was limited to the freeing of Kuwait, not to go beyond that to free the Iraqi people at the time. The opportunity was missed. The internal challenges to the Gulf state is very serious, but manageable to my mind. They are relatively small countries and have potential resources to manage the challenges coming from the demand of the local people. Although those demands are growing because of the changing of population, but it's work in semi-equation. The more material satisfaction granted to the local people, the less government face political challenges, and vice versa. And the less material satisfaction, the less political tolerance could occur. But this situation, acute dissatisfaction, is not imminent or become problem in the near future as far as I can see. But other elements could interfere with the Gulf security and bring instability with roots in 3 major trends. The first one, internal fighting between the Gulf countries, and what's happening, being recognized today as a Qatar crisis, which emerged publicly on the 5th of May 2017. I said publicly because there was a number of differences from a good number of years between X or Y Gulf state. But that was discussed most of the time behind closed doors, and the participants drive into some sort of permanent or tentative understanding to the issue in hand. It was mostly manageable in one way or another, but it was always there before independence of 1970 and after that. What has happened recently on the 5th of May 2017 is the largest in scale and time. It's consumed so far a lot of energy, money, and diplomatic efforts from both parties. The differences now between the differences now become a burden on security and social fabrics to all parties involved in the dispute. The Kuwaiti effort to come to a certain situation, to rapprochement, still not secured. The more time it takes, the more serious it will become to hold security of the region. Kuwait government, led by His Highness the Emir, tried to end between the parties with very little success. Therefore, the mediation is still there and very highly needed to meet the differences between the Gulf countries, Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. There is a growing number of Gulf citizens, people like me, very worried of the impact of the crisis on the future of security and GCC itself, and the stability of the region as a whole, especially if it's open the opportunity for regional power to advance their interests in the region. The more time it takes, the higher prices could be paid by the parties involved, not just exhausting the material resources of the parties, but also missing the convenient to development and displaying danger for the collective security. The crisis for a good number of observers in the Gulf as a whole is a loss situation. At the end, the more time it takes to be solved, the dangerous the security of the region become. The second point of my talk is taking the escalation of the American-Iranian dispute. The latter could use the same sort of strategy which has been using in some other places for years. And it's clearly to everybody, it's a successful one. What is it? Using the Iranian sleeping cells to play havoc to the security of the Gulf region. They have done this in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and tried in Bahrain, Arabia, and elsewhere as far as Morocco. The Iranian, to my mind, will not engage in the future, if they can, in direct conflict either with the United States or the Gulf countries. Instead, they will use one way or another all in their disposal through groups adhere to them, either ideologically or out of material interest, to disable the Gulf region. This, what they are doing in Yemen, financing and supporting and training the Houthis in a view to deplete Saudi Arabia resources and thus cripple the bigger state in the Gulf, then easily subjected the smaller states for the Iranian will. My final point is the United States. The reluctance of the positive American policy in the region, although Obama and Trump has different approach for foreign policy, some of them oppose each other to my mind, but both administration has missed the wisdom of Mr. Abraham Lincoln, who has said, I am slow walking, but I never walk backward. Walking backwards is the phrase to describe the American attitudes today to the Middle East as a whole, and to the Gulf region. That's why Iranians are advancing from one side, the Russian from the other. The Turks are seizing the opportunity. There are no focus from the American point of view on what is the general interest of our people in the Gulf and the American interest by both administration and this one specifically. And it is not spending the time and effort to look seriously to the region major problem and try to engage positively with it, especially the Gulf crisis. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Dr. Ulrichsen, I'm hoping you can give us some account of why the Americans behave this way and what we can expect in the future.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for this extraordinarily and I suppose tragically timing of this event. And I hope that we can do justice to the legacy of Jamal Khashoggi by having an event like this today and many more in the future. US-Gulf relations have always been about much more than just arms sales, as we've heard so much about over the past week or so. It's always been about much more than just oil and gas as well. We have people-to-people relationships. We have, of course, increasing educational partnerships with the region. We have new frontiers with technology companies moving into the Gulf, taking advantage and building upon the Gulf region's high-income, very youthful populations. And so to reduce a relationship to an issue of arms and arms purchases is quite a horrifically reductionist. Even in the case of energy, for example, we have interdependence. And one of the issues that Gulf ruling circles took so much exception to under the Obama administration was the so-called pivot to Asia, which is always more rhetoric than reality in the sense that the US was never abandoning its interests in the Gulf. But it became a sort of shorthand for everything the Gulf rulers seemed to dislike about the Obama administration, and the feeling perhaps that they were being abandoned by their most important security and political partner. But if we think about the pivot to Asia economically, East Asian economies are far more dependent upon the Gulf as a source of energy than the US or many other parts of the world. And so the interests of interdependence are such that it should be in everybody's interests, especially the US interest, that we have stability and security in the Gulf, because an impact there would have immediate ripple and knock-on effects worldwide. One of the challenges, of course, looking at the Gulf now and perhaps moving forward, is that the region has always been seen, or at least for the last 30 to 40 years, since the formation of the GCC in 1981, as the sort of oasis of stability in an otherwise highly insecure part of the world. I mean, let's not forget the GCC came together as a response to war and revolution, a revolution in Iran and the Iran-Iraq war. But it has survived and it has endured three major conflicts in the Gulf: the Iran-Iraq war, the 1991 liberation of Kuwait, and the 2003 Iraq war. And it did so largely intact and as a place where you could do business in a stable and largely predictable manner. And the concern is that the succession of shocks over the past 2 or 3 years, the siege of Qatar, the reputational issues with doing business now in Saudi Arabia, are undermining and undercutting the notion that the Gulf is a safe place to do business and that the political risk of doing so is much lower than in other parts of the region, in a sense that companies who wanted a foothold in the Middle East could go to Dubai, for example, are now having problems, of course, doing business with Qatar. And so the sort of the reputation of the Gulf as a place where, to some extent, in certain places, you could do business without sort of taking politics and geopolitics out of the equation, is now being called into question. And that's even before the events of the last 2 weeks and the incredibly rapid rise of political risk in Saudi Arabia, and the notion that with the current Saudi leadership, the reputational costs of doing so may at some point become much greater, as we see with the withdrawal of so many participants in the Future Investment Initiative. The GCC itself has also been damaged, clearly by the split, partly, of course, because at almost every stage of the Qatar crisis, the GCC has not really been involved. It has not been a mechanism through which the three states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, channeled their frustrations or their grievances, or used the GCC as a way to mediate and to try and resolve the issue. At every stage of this crisis, the GCC has really been absent. And Qataris or other countries in the GCC may be wondering why they can ever trust the organization again after it's failed to prevent 3 of its members from turning on a 4th, twice now in just over 3 years. The GCC likely will carry on as an organization. It will limp along, but of course its economic and political progress towards a form of closer integration, always more economic than political, has been undermined. The common market, for example, is heavily compromised by the fact that 3 states are now close to a 4th. The plans, for example, for a common VAT have also been put on ice, and so have many of the regional infrastructure projects that were pan-GCC in nature. Although the technocratic ones will probably continue, and of course we have seen no disruption in the supply of energy from Qatar to Dubai and on to Abu Dhabi and then on to Oman. So that's at least a building block for the future to try and take politics out of the equation and at least maintain a technocratic cooperation. The challenge for economies in the GCC going forward is that there was a window of opportunity in 2014, 2015, 2016, when oil prices were so low and deficits were rising so fast that Gulf leaders saw an opportunity to try and push through some of the more challenging measures they had always shied against. So we saw a succession of subsidy reductions, for example, in energy. We saw new taxes and fees. We saw in Saudi Arabia especially very drastic budget cuts and attempts to try and slim down the state. And all of these would be necessary to move forward. The challenge now, of course, is that prices of oil are now back at levels where, to some extent, countries can live with. And the window of opportunity may now have closed. And politically, it might be more difficult to push through those politically, economically painful reforms, which would just leave kick the problem down the road, which has always, I think, been the preferred course of action. Of course, the next crisis may be greater still. I mean, in hindsight, we may look back at the decade of the 2000s as a period of sustained high oil prices and low political risk as the sort of missed opportunity when ruling circles could have tried to make Gulf economies more sustainable over the longer term. And the risk remains that reforms will be delayed until the point of almost no return, and that's not in anybody's interest, least of all the US. Just finally, Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia is so closely linked with Mohammed bin Salman that if the cost of doing business in or with Saudi Arabia is now going to be so high that Vision 2030, which is so heavily predicated upon foreign investment, is now in jeopardy, then I think there are real questions over the Crown Prince's political future as well, given that he's made it his calling card. And part of his appeal to so many young people in Saudi Arabia was that he could change the country, and in a sense only he could do it. And the concern, of course, there is if, say, in 5 or 10 years, nothing in practice has really changed, what happens next? And I think these are all issues that we should be looking for in our sort of analyses that go beyond the immediate ramifications of the current crisis in US-Saudi relations and perhaps in Saudi Arabia's sort of position in the regional and international community. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm asked to remind you that there are these question cards at the tables, and there are people to collect them. Ambassador Feierstein, tell us, what is to be done about Yemen, which is on the verge of real catastrophe?
Thanks, Daniel, and I think I'll continue our alternation between standers and sitters, so I'll just stay here and try to answer the question. I've been asked to speak on the subject of the role of the international community in solving the apparent stalemate in the war in Yemen, and how might an agreement be reached between the warring parties. And basically what I'd like to say is that we need to look at this in a phased approach, that if we try to tackle all of the challenges confronting Yemen right now, the likelihood is that we will fail to achieve a sustainable solution to any of them. So basically what I would say is that we should continue down the road that Martin Griffiths is already on, which is to look primarily at the most urgent issue which is confronting Yemen right now, and that is to bring an end to the conflict between the Houthis and their allies on one side and the government and the Saudi-led coalition on the other side. And by achieving a sustainable ceasefire, you can then address the humanitarian crisis, which obviously is drawing the attention of the entire world, restore economic activity, which is a part of the challenge on the humanitarian side, and also to try to bring down the war economy, which is one of the issues that's sustaining this current conflict, and then to try to reestablish some semblance of stable governance in Sana'a. There's reason for optimism that Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Envoy, continues to have legitimacy in the eyes of all of the parties. The effort to bring the parties together in Geneva in early September unfortunately didn't succeed, but we understand that he's likely to try again sometime in the next few weeks to at least get the parties to sit in the same city, if not in the same room. And in order to do that, hopefully Griffiths will be able to count on stronger international support. We've heard from the State Department, from Deputy Assistant Secretary Lenderking, that the United States is pressing the coalition to do more to advance the political process and to wind down the military campaign. We also understand, of course, that there is equal pressure in London on the UK government to step up pressure for political progress. How the Jamal Khashoggi issue plays into the U.S. conversation with the Saudis and the Emiratis on the conflict in Yemen remains to be seen. But I do think it's fair to say that the United States has become more concerned. We've heard more from Secretary Mattis as well as others in recent weeks about their concerns about the continuation of the conflict. So on the one hand, I think that we would like to see greater activism on the part, particularly of Secretary Pompeo, that this is an important element. We really haven't seen senior level U.S. engagement since Secretary Kerry left office. I think that the UK, as the convener of the Friends of Yemen, has a role to play in bringing that organization more into the conversation and to do more to support. The Friends of Yemen is about 25 different countries. All of the key supporters of Yemen are part of it. It is a vehicle. And having said that, I would also make the point that I think that there is a lot of conversation about whether or not there should be a new UN Security Council resolution, whether we should take the issue back to the Security Council. Personally, I think that would be a mistake for two reasons. One, I don't think it's necessary. Both Ismail Sheikh Ahmed and Martin Griffiths have demonstrated a willingness to color well outside the lines of UNSCR 2216 in trying to achieve a resolution. And the concern that I have is that if we do try to get a new resolution and it doesn't succeed, in fact, we'll end up in a worse situation than we are now with 2216. The other point that I would make on the international community in this current phase is the question of whether Russia and Iran have roles to play. And in my view, I think that this is something that is deserving of serious consideration. One of the issues that we have is that the international pressure that is exerted on the parties to the Yemen conflict right now is almost entirely on one side of the equation. It's almost entirely on the side of the government and the Saudi-led coalition. There's no equivalent pressure on the Houthis, nor does the international community, as it's currently engaged, have the ability to really approach or address the Houthi issue. The Russians and Iranians do have that capability if they choose to exercise it. They're both involved in the issue right now. in a negative way. If we can make them a part of a constructive approach to resolving the issue, I think that that's something to be explored. Beyond that, if you succeed in achieving those immediate goals and objectives, then you get into the larger issue, the one that we've avoided so far, and that is, how do you get past resolving the conflict, the fighting that's going on right now, and begin to try to get to a sustainable solution so that we don't simply generate a new round of fighting a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road again. And there, I think that there's still not a clear understanding about how you get to that transition point. An awful lot will depend on how the Yemenis want to manage this, but we do need to work on the fundamental issues that have driven conflict in Yemen really for the past 60+ years, and those are marginalization, extractive political and economic structures, sectional rivalries, and a sense of economic and social inequality. So how do you do that? We tried to do that in 2011-12 through the GCC initiative. That didn't fail. I think that we need to take another look at how we get back. Again, that primarily depends on Yemeni decisions, but I think that there are things that the international community can do that would help advance that objective. In the sense of the GCC states who will bear primary responsibility, I think that one thing that's very important is for the GCC to declare their support for Yemen's unity and respect for its sovereignty and territorial integrity. And over the course of this conflict, I think questions have been raised about that. We need to resolve those. They need to take the lead in reconstruction and in trying to help the Yemenis repair the damage that's been done over these last few years, new infrastructure projects to promote broad-based economic development. They should open the doors for Yemeni workers to come back into the Gulf states. That would help get capital into Yemen and provide economic activity there. And finally, they should eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. Bring the GCC, bring Yemen into the GCC, and allow them to benefit from their competitive advantages in doing business primarily with the GCC. For the broader international community, I think, again, the Friends of Yemen have a role to play in making clear that they're committed to a long-term, sustained approach to Yemen's political and economic development. The UN should continue to provide expert assistance to the Yemenis as they work through some of these issues on sustainability. The International Foundation for Electoral Systems should help prepare the country for a new round of elections. There has not been a legitimately elected government of Yemen for over a decade now. That needs to be addressed. World Bank and International Monetary Fund have roles to play in promoting broad-based economic development. And finally, the Friends of Yemen, again, through bilateral development assistance programs, should focus on institutional capacity building as well as ensuring that all Yemenis have access to effective health care and educational facilities. And let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Congressman?
Yeah, oh, that was the introduction? Okay. Good. So, we got, first of all, let me express my humility, if you will, being included in such a distinguished, knowledgeable, insightful, articulate panel. So I may not belong here, but I guess I can answer the topic that I've been given. How have domestic U.S. politics over past administrations affected United States policy decisions towards the Gulf region, the Iran nuclear deal, Yemen? I'm going to leave alone Yemen because Jerry did such a phenomenal job explaining Yemen. There's nothing more to say, and I agree with everything he said. weapons sales, U.S. policy vis-a-vis Iraq, et cetera. So basically, that's quite a chalkboard that I can easily fill up. So the first thing I need to know is, where is the GIF person that's going to give me the hook when which one is it? Yeah, I can't.
I'll take care of you.
You'll take care of, okay, Dan, fine, because I can't see under the light, and I don't want to run on too long. I appreciate all of you for being here, but you are not a random sample of the American people. There aren't 0.5% of the American population that could even identify where the Gulf Coast countries are located, let alone explain the politics that's going on within the GCC. And as a result, when we have an event, an anecdotal example of some of the repression, for example, that's taking place in some of these countries, most notably Saudi Arabia, all of a sudden it provides a prism through which we will view a part of the country that, even notwithstanding China and Russia, may be the most repressive part of the planet in terms of the freedoms that we feel ought to be defining us and that we espouse throughout the world through our foreign policy. It's going to be a very harsh spotlight, given the murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. It was a stupid thing to do. And the Washington Post is not going to let it go, nor will the New York Times. It is inconceivable that someone who understood the politics of the United States and was forward-thinking and had some maturity of experience that comes with experience would do such a thing. So it clearly came out of hubris, impetuousness, and some kind of delusional thinking. So I want to particularly address that. But I'll explain what I mean in terms of the relative ignorance of the United States. On the Iran nuclear deal, I was stunned that the Obama administration was able to get that passed. That was a phenomenal accomplishment. And went up against AIPAC, went up against some of the most vociferous opponents, both Prime Minister Netanyahu against Saudi Arabia, and took them all on and was able to pass it. And it was a good, important, needed deal to be accomplished. It's inexcusable. May not be inexplicable, but it's inexcusable that it's now been broken, that it's being taken apart, and we're going to go back to a worse point than before we accomplished that. When we went into the Iraq War, which was another mistake, we did so without sufficient understanding of the consequences. Our soldiers obviously didn't have a clue why we were there, when most of them, the infantry certainly, which comprised most of the soldiers we put over in Iraq, were asked why are we there. The most common response was, well, we're here to get them back for what they did to us on 9/11, not understanding that Iraq was not involved in 9/11 in any way, despite attempts to tie Iraq to it, and with weapons of mass destruction and so on. All of those efforts failed, and accusations proved hollow. So it was a terrible mistake, and we're still dealing with the consequences. It was like sticking a fist into a hornet's nest, and those hornets are still buzzing around, causing problems. So that's the context. Now, we have been buying oil and thinking we can control the price for the benefit of Western economies. And we have been supporting totalitarian repressive governments, far more repressive than the American people have any concept of. And so now we have this spotlight. I think it is going to result in a very consequential transformation, because I don't see it going away. The newly elected Democratic majority, which I expect on November 6th, is not going to let it go away, because it was symptomatic of some of the issues that need to be addressed in terms of foreign policy. And as I said, our principal media outlets, particularly the Post, are not going to let it go away. So to keep it from going away, they're going to come forward with one news story after another. And there are so many stories that they may not be as dramatic as killing someone on foreign soil in a consulate and bringing a bone saw in and cutting up their body and taking it out in a box. But there's a whole lot of stories about journalists and activists, and particularly women who have advocated for the most moderate of reforms, being imprisoned, not being heard from. Some of them are gone. Some have been tortured. And we will pursue this as best we can, even notwithstanding the fact that the Saudi government is not used to this kind of exposure. So I think it's going to have some effect on policy. And I say that because even today, every single day since this has come to light, more large, influential corporations have taken actions to withdraw their support from certainly the Saudi Economic Conference, but from even representing Saudi Arabia. More lobbying and law firms pulled out today. So this is a trend, and others will be measured by those who have already made that decision. Things have acquire a momentum. They take on a momentum of their own. So whatever comes of this investigation, I think that it's going to be very difficult to continue to suppress information within Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, particularly even in Egypt. And I think you may not see another version of the Arab Spring, but I do think that you're going to see some political chaos taking place. And I don't think the administration is going to be able to suppress it much as they would like to. And obviously, I'm not going to go down this direction because it's a digression. But obviously, the Trump family has interests which are also vulnerable in this situation. So stay tuned. I see Dan is standing up, so that indicates my time is up. But I hope that we get some questions about this, and I promise you I will be more candid than I have been in my comments so far.
Thank you, Congressman. In the interest of time, I'm going to do all the questions at once, some of them directed to specific individuals. Then we'll go back through the panel as quickly as we can, and we have to wrap up by 10:30. Number of people in the audience want to know what's next in Saudi Arabia after this incident? What's Mohammed bin Salman's future? Can we expect dramatic change? Martin, Chris Carl asks, will the Arab NATO, whatever it's going to be called, work in the light of what's happened? Dr. Rumaihi, what's the scenario from your perspective, a good scenario for the Yemen war, or is there a good scenario? That was a question from Adam Smith. Dr. Najma Al-Zijali of Georgetown and Sultan Qaboos University asks Dr. Rumaihi, you put the emphasis on the material welfare of people in the Gulf, but aren't there non-material factors that are also very important? Elizabeth Stanton asks Dr. Ulrichsen, why haven't the economic pressures of the continuing war in Yemen caused the Saudis to ramp down their efforts already? And how do you see the direction for the future of the Gulf crisis? Also for you, Dr. Ulrichsen, the question is, how much is this, the Khashoggi incident going to affect business that's conducted in the Gulf? Donald Grant of the American Enterprise Institute asks Ambassador Feierstein, how might militarization of the Red Sea affect Yemen? And is this a, I would add, is this a kind of permanent new issue that we have with the Bab el-Mandeb especially? Congressman, Ben Sloan asks simply, can Congress really do anything about Middle East policy? And there's a comment from Imam Ali Siddiq with which I'm mildly sympathetic, which asks the question, when will we hear from Iran at conferences on the Gulf? That is, I take him to mean directly from the Iranian government, which isn't possible under current circumstances. But I'll leave that as a comment towards the end. Martin, would you like to start us off?
Sure, thank you, Daniel. And well done in terms of organizing these questions. Look, in every crisis, there is an opportunity. And I think that we should also discuss that. This is a huge challenge to Mohammed bin Salman's control, rule, and agenda for Saudi Arabia. He was bound to be a consequential figure given the reform program that he embarked upon. But the rash, headstrong way in which he acted, the arrogance of power that he has brought to bear in such a ruthless way, has created real problems for what I believe was a noble endeavor in terms of the reform of Saudi Arabia and dragging it into the 21st century. But it's put that in jeopardy. And the negative consequences of the way in which he's acting are so counterproductive that what could have been consequentially important and positive for Saudi Arabia and beyond that, the Arab and Muslim worlds, is now potentially equally negatively consequential as the potential for the whole thing unraveling is very real. The United States has a huge stake in what happens now. We have for 2 years wondered how President Trump would deal with an international crisis. He has one upon him now, and one in which I think, unfortunately, he is ill-equipped to deal with. But nevertheless, there's too much at stake now. I think that the most important thing that Secretary Pompeo can do is, first of all, engage. He has been essentially, in many ways, missing in action, except for the campaign against Iran. He should have been actively involved in trying to reconcile the Gulf states and resolve that conflict, which was so deleterious to American interests. But he has an opportunity now. And I hope that he engages in the following ways. First of all, to convince Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman that it is essential now for Saudi Arabia to withdraw from Yemen, to announce that intention, to call the warring parties to a summit, and to resolve the arrangements, that many of which Jerry has outlined this morning, but also security arrangements, and in that way focus Saudi Arabia's efforts not on worsening the humanitarian crisis, but on mending the humanitarian crisis. It would be the only way that one could say that Jamal Khashoggi did not die in vain if it precipitated an end to Saudi involvement in Yemen, which would be to the benefit not just of Yemen, but of Saudi Arabia as well. He should double down on his reform agenda, and we should encourage him to do so, starting by releasing the women that he has arrested. And in that way, to try to re-engender some faith in the whole enterprise that is so critically important. As far as the prospects for the Arab NATO, well, just calling it the Arab NATO has now kind of dimmed the prospects. At least it hasn't been called the New Baghdad Pact. But it's a misconceived notion. The idea that, as Professor Rumaihi has so well explained, that you can somehow build an anti-Iran coalition among states. 3 of the 5 states are pursuing a siege and boycott of a 4th member of this would-be NATO coalition is simply can't function, can't work. To bring Egypt into the effort suggests a complete misunderstanding of Egyptian foreign policy. Egypt is not interested in a confrontation with Iran, never has been, and will not join an anti-Iran coalition. And Jordan is too vulnerable to sign up to this. So now we're going to focus on the economic benefits of an alliance. You'll be hearing that more and more because the strategic effort, I think, was doomed from the get-go. Yes, that will be worthwhile. But I think that in essence, you have to deal with first things first. Resolve the GCC crisis and then see how you can develop common interest in promoting the security of the Gulf. Thank you.
Dr. Rumaihi, 2 minutes.
Yes, 2 minutes. It's very short. Yemen crisis. I will start by saying there was a very interesting book written by an American of Lebanese origin. His name is Amin Al-Rihani. That book was published in the mid-20s, last century. when he was preparing to this, the book called Arab Kings. When he was preparing to his journey, he was visiting one of a New York bookshop, and this gentleman came, and he thought, well, this, from his talk, that he is some sort of an Arab. So he asked him, where are you from? He said, I'm from Yemen. And he said, what do you do in Yemen? He said, well, Yemen is a very nice place. We have a huge Jebel and mountains and very nice water. And he said, what do you do? He said, we fight. To fight? To fight whom? He said. I mean, this is recorded in this book. He said, we fight the invaders, like the Turks, the British, and if we don't find anybody, we fight each other. So that's Yemen, unfortunately. And the new aspect of that is the money and training and support of the Iranian. So if that was not there, probably the Houthis will come to the negotiating table much easier than they are doing now. Now, the Iranian, to my mind, I do respect the other point of view, but to my mind, I'm not against the Iranian because they are Shia. Well, there is plenty of Shia Arabs, and they are Arabs at all. But what they are doing is they're trying to fulfill this vague idea of Al-Mahdi al-Muntadhar. Al-Mahdi al-Muntadhar, to their religious ideas, he will come from Mecca. So unless we occupied Mecca, Al-Mahdi will not come. So this is one of the problems. How can we do that? We try it from the south. We try it from the north, whatever it is. Unfortunately, this is the general situation in Yemen. And of course, there are some other elements there. What I can and phrase it as the enviness of the rich cousin. Poor countries with rich places, and this has played all the time, the envy of what has happened. I have an example. Sorry, I have just general example of that. The Kuwaitis, for instance, have supported Yemen by building universities, schools, hospitals. And when the invasion occurred, the Iraqi invasion occurred to Kuwait, the first who had taken a negative attitude was the Yemen. Why is that? I don't know. So this is how it is. This is one.
I'm going to have to stop you there.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Dr. Ulrichsen.
Okay, thank you. Economic pressures of the war in Yemen on Saudi are very real. I mean, there's no agreed upon figure for how much the campaign is costing. Of course, there were issues that are non-military, the monies that are being paid to support various tribal and militia groups in Yemen, for example, the eventual cost of reconstruction, border security, pension costs, kind of medical costs for Saudi personnel who have been injured, will long continue into the future. And those costs are increasing and continuing to increase at a time of budget cuts elsewhere. And I mean, that could at some point become a political issue. In terms of the future of the Gulf crisis, this potentially now is an opportunity for the US to really pressure the Saudis in the sense that if there's any leverage that the US government can now try and exert on the Saudis, is that it's in the interest of the US and all of its partners in the Gulf that this crisis in the Gulf be resolved. Up till now, the US has made it very clear, I think, over the past year that it wants the crisis resolved, but the Saudis and especially the Emiratis have refused to go along. Now, of course, there's a pressure point potentially on the Saudis to use as leverage, saying this crisis helps nobody. Of course, especially as the US is trying to mobilize its partners against Iran to try and contain Iran. And so that is a potential way they could try and do it. Of course, how will Mohammed bin Zayed and Abu Dhabi react to any potential rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, should that be possible, is another matter and perhaps something that's unpredictable. And then finally, how much will Jamal Khashoggi's death, or presumed death, affect doing business in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf? Well, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, obviously we're seeing a lot of companies, as the Congressman pointed out, pulling out of Saudi Arabia right now, but at least just suspending business and perhaps pulling out of the conference in Riyadh next week. And it'll be interesting to see if that pressure continues, if they not just suspend but end business in Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Saudis and perhaps even the White House may be hoping that obviously attention now will focus on the midterm elections for the next 3 weeks. And by that point, this crisis may have blown over. So I mean, that could be the calculation they're trying to make. And whether or not this is still a major political issue for Congress after November 6, and going into the next year, will determine, I think, whether or not there's a future for, whether or not this is more than just a flash in the pan or something much deeper and more systemic. My hunch is it probably will be, because the depth of outrage is so bipartisan, and I suspect we'll have a lot more details coming out, but we'll just have to wait and see on that.
Jerry?
Very quickly, the issue of growing international competition in the Red Sea littoral is in fact a serious issue, and an issue that is having a negative impact on Yemen and the conflict inside of Yemen. What we're seeing right now is increasingly you have Qatar and Turkey and the UAE in particular, all of whom are looking for advantage on both sides of the Red Sea, particularly in the Horn of Africa, all the way up to the Suez Canal. And to a certain extent, you have a competition inside of Yemen between the UAE, which might see Yemen, and particularly access to the port of Aden, as well as Mukalla and some of the others, going all the way up the coast of Hodeidah, as a strategic advantage in terms of their own ability to establish a dominant position for themselves in the Red Sea region. And then you have the Iranians, who are also, of course, looking at Yemen, and in particular, you asked about the Bab el-Mandeb. In fact, from an Iranian calculation, we've already seen that they see their ability to maintain a foothold in Yemen that allows them to threaten international shipping in the Bab as a strategic advantage in terms of their competition with the United States and the Western community. So all of this is bringing attention to the Yemen conflict, unfortunately leading the various outside parties to look for advantages in terms of promoting disintegration in Yemen. I think it's extremely important for the international community to make very clear that within the context of UNSCR 2216, the international community absolutely is committed to the territorial integrity and unity of Yemen going forward.
Congressman.
All right, thanks, Dan. So can the Congress really do anything? A lot of it obviously depends upon several factors. One is a person in the White House. If he was to take decisive, substantive action, then the Congress would have less of a role. But all indications are that he will not do that. Coming up with this goofy theory that they were rogue killers that somehow slipped into the consulate in Istanbul, and I mean, it obviously wasn't given a whole lot of thought, but that's probably what the first idea that they came up with. You deny, and then you try to deflect. That's not going to work. So, yes, I think the Congress is going to pursue this. Now, what will be the effect? I think all they have to do is to shine a spotlight on what's going on in Saudi Arabia. Now, on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, people like Jerry Connolly, who was on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in his younger years, he knows the situation. He does understand it. You've got, Ted Deutsch, Cicilline, Ted Lieu. There's a lot of people who are worth watching. Adam Schiff understands that the situation in the Gulf. I think you're going to have some hearings. And the United Arab Emirates is going to also have the spotlight exposed on them. They're extremely vulnerable, and I understand that there'll be a fair amount of vulnerability exposed in the Mueller investigation, which will be fun to read about. Plus the fact that 98% of Iranian trade actually goes through the Emirates. It doesn't go through Qatar. I think you'll see on the Lantos Human Rights Commission a number of hearings. And one of the factors that hasn't been given much attention are the number of women that are going to be elected in this new Congress on both sides of the aisle. And they're going to be looking at women's rights, which are virtually non-existent in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, and, well, you know better than I. So, and on appropriations, there was an amendment on the Senate side that only failed by 4 votes to block arms sales to Saudi Arabia that could be used to continue waging the war in Yemen. That will pass next time it comes up. And I think you're going to see some language on foreign ops, not just to stop the blockade of Qatar, but you're going to see some other rather punitive language. So, you know, defense contractors like Saudi Arabia for obvious reasons, but the Defense Department understands that it needs that Al Udeid air base outside Doha, and I think you're going to see, and in terms of intelligence, which is always brought up, the intelligence was worthwhile, and when Mohammed bin Nayef was providing it, it's not much now. So, you know, I do think a lot of things are going to be changing very fast, and it's going to be fun to watch.
Thank the panel for a great opening of what will prove to be a great day.